picture this. You're standing in the supplement aisle of a high-end grocery store.
Oh, yeah. We have all been there.
Right. Or maybe you're just endlessly scrolling through one of those specialized online dispensaries. And the sheer volume of options is just, it's staggering.
It really is overwhelming.
You're looking at hundreds of these beautifully designed bottles, minimalist labels, promising things like cellular optimization or telomere support.
Bioharmonization is a big one right now.
Yes, bioharmonization.
Yeah.
So if you pick one up, you check the back, and the nutritional panel looks like this dense biochemical schematic.
Right, and it's almost designed to obscure more than it actually reveals.
Exactly, and if you are navigating this space with any level of seriousness, you're constantly asking yourself, how much of this is actually metabolically active, and how much is just highly optimized marketing?
Well, it is a deliberate opacity. The market is basically structured to blur that line between a genuinely active biological compound and, a well-packaged placebo.
Yeah.
The industry kind of thrives on the assumption that you look at a long list of complex chemical names and just, assume efficacy.
Which brings us to the focus of today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We are tearing into a really comprehensive piece of source material today. It's an April 2026 guide from Ingredientsage.
Authored by Laurent Fabian, right?
Yep, wellness innovator Laurent Fabian. And the piece is titled Food Supplement Vitamins, a comprehensive guide to choosing, using, and staying safe.
And the real value of this specific source material is its intended audience.
Right, it's not for us.
Exactly. It isn't a consumer-facing brochure. It is written as a functional guide for formulators and manufacturers, so it really exposes the structural framework of the whole industry.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you are actively investing in your metabolic health, you really need to understand the underlying mechanisms at play here.
You absolutely do.
So today, we are stripping away the front label marketing. We're going to examine the specific enzymatic pathways that make certain chemical forms of a vitamin utterly useless.
Yeah, that's a huge issue.
And we'll look at the hidden transport mechanisms that create these crazy mineral traffic jams in your gut. And of course, the genetic variables that are completely changing the landscape of supplementation in 2026.
Well, the logical starting point here is the regulatory environment, because ultimately, that environment dictates what actually ends up in the capsule you take.
Right.
The United States market is still largely operating under the shadow of the 1994 Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. You'll usually hear it called DSHEA.
Right, DSHEA. And I kind of look at DSHEA as a double-edged sword,
How so?
Well, on one hand, it was designed 30 years ago to protect consumer access to basic botanicals, like natural remedies, without forcing them through this massive, multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical approval bottleneck.
Right, which makes sense for basic herbs.
Exactly. But today, we aren't just talking about echinacea and garlic root anymore. We're dealing with highly concentrated, synthesized, really bioactive compounds that are hiding behind that exact same 1994 legislation.
What's fascinating here is how manufacturers can legally leverage what are called structure-function claims under that framework.
Okay, break that down for us. What does that mean?
So they can state a compound supports immune pathway response, or that it maintains healthy inflammatory markers.
Just really broad, generalized statements.
Exactly. The only hard line they cannot cross without FDA authorization is a direct disease claim. They cannot say it cures arthritis.
Right.
But the critical flaw here is the enforcement mechanism. The FDA operates almost entirely on post-market surveillance.
Meaning the burden of proof is totally inverted.
Exactly.
The product just sits on the shelf until someone proves it's adulterated, rather than the company having to prove it's pure before it ever gets authorized to be sold.
Right. So as a consumer, relying on baseline federal compliance is, it's essentially flying blind.
So what do? Just hope for the best.
No, it forces you to rely entirely on voluntary third-party validation. In 2026, the absence of a recognized third-party certification is just a massive red flag.
So what are the specific logos or marks you should be looking for?
The baseline is looking for an NSF-certified or USP-verified mark, or informed choice.
And what do those actually guarantee?
They prove that an independent lab has run high-performance liquid chromatography or mass spectrometry to confirm that the ingredient identity actually matches the label.
Wow, okay. And for the absolute top-tier products?
For those, we are looking for a batch-specific COA, a certificate of analysis.
Right, because I know botanicals and synthetic hybrids have massive batch-to-batch variability, just based on how they're extracted.
Exactly. If a manufacturer will not show you the COA for the specific lot number you are holding in your hand,
You just have to assume the active ingredient is degraded.
you really do. And the other major red flag on a label, which the guide points out, is the proprietary blend.
Oh, man. Proprietary blends absolutely infuriate me.
They are heavily utilized, though.
I know, but it's the equivalent of a restaurant serving you a dish and refusing to tell you what's in it because it's a secret family recipe.
Okay.
But we are talking about human biology here. We need the recipe.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, they group 10 impressive-sounding molecular compounds under some name like neuro-optimization matrix. And they list a total weight of, say, 1,000 milligrams.
Right.
But the actual bioactive compounds might make up like 2 milligrams of that total, while the other 998 milligrams are just cheap ascorbic acid acting as filler. You have zero visibility into what you're actually taking.
And the source material heavily emphasizes this exact point. Explicit per-serving dosages are non-negotiable.
Period.
If you cannot see the exact milligram or microgram count of a specific compound, the product is deliberately designed to deceive you.
But, you know, a COA and an explicit label, they really only prove the molecules in the bottle. It doesn't prove the molecule belongs in your cells.
That is a crucial distinction.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the actual chemical geometry of the vitamin dictates whether your body can metabolize it at all.
Right.
I like to think of it like keys and locks.
Right.
We talk about vitamin D or vitamin B12 as these monolithic concepts, but they are really broad chemical categories. And some keys fit the body's locks perfectly and turn easily.
And some require a lot of wiggling.
Yeah. And some are just the completely wrong key.
Exactly. Bioavailability is entirely dependent on the specific isomer or chemical form. Let's take vitamin D, which is universally supplemented.
Right. Everyone takes vitamin D.
You primarily see it as D2, which is ergocalciferol. That's derived from plants or fungi.
Yeah.
And then there's D3, cholecalciferol.
Now, D2 is way cheaper to produce.
Right.
Which is why it absolutely floods the mass market multivitamin.
It does, but the biology tells a very different story. When you ingest vitamin D, your liver actually has to hydroxylate it into a form called calcifediol, which then travels to your kidneys to become the active steroid hormone. The thing is, D3 has a significantly higher affinity for the vitamin D binding protein in your bloodstream.
So it's just better at its job.
Much better.
Yeah.
It is far more efficient at raising and sustaining your baseline serum levels than D2, usually in that 1,000 to 4,000 IU daily range.
We see a really similar metabolic hurdle with B12, but I actually want to challenge a prevailing narrative here.
Okay, let's hear it.
You constantly see cyanocobalamin versus methylcobalamin online. Cyanocobalamin is the cheap synthetic form, and there are all these really aggressive online campaigns claiming it's toxic because it contains a cyanide donor molecule.
Yes, the cyanide fear-mongering.
Right. But let's be real. The trace amount of cyanide in a daily dose of cyanocobalamin is a fraction of a microgram. I mean, you ingest more cyanide eating a single almond or a big salad with spinach.
That is entirely accurate.
So is the fear-mongering justified biologically, or is this just an upscale marketing tactic to sell the more expensive methylcobalamin form?
Well, the focus on cyanide toxicity is largely a distraction. You are absolutely correct about that. The human liver easily clears that microscopic amount.
Okay, so what is the actual issue with it then?
The real biological problem with cyanocobalamin is the metabolic tax it imposes on your body.
The metabolic tax.
Right. To utilize cyanocobalamin, your body has to actively strip away that cyanide molecule and attach a metal group in its place.
Ah, so it's an unnecessary conversion step.
Exactly. And that conversion step requires highly efficient methylation pathways. The problem is a significant portion of the population carries genetic polymorphisms.
Right, like the MTHFR gene.
Precisely.
Right.
If you have variants in your MTHFR gene, it drastically reduces your enzymatic ability to perform that methylation.
So what happens to the B12 then?
For those individuals, dumping a massive dose of cyanocobalamin into their system is basically useless. It builds up in the blood serum, but it doesn't cross the cellular threshold.
Yeah.
Methylcobalamin, conversely, is already bioactive. It bypasses that enzymatic bottleneck entirely, which is why it's so crucial for older adults, vegans, or anyone with absorption impairments.
Which brings up a really interesting problem. Let's say you do everything right. You use the right form. You use methylcobalamin, or in the case of fat-soluble vitamins, maybe you even use a lipid nanoparticle delivery system, like an oil carrier, so the nutrient survives the digestive tract.
Right. Sublinguals or lipid carriers are great for that.
So now the bioactive compound is circulating in your blood perfectly intact. It still has to know where to go, right? It needs a targeting system, which leads us to vitamin K, specifically K2.
Yes. Vitamin K2 is the ultimate biological targeting system, particularly the MK7 or menaquinone-7 form.
Because K1 does something completely different, right?
Exactly. K1 is primarily sequestered by the liver for blood coagulation, but K2-MK7 operates systemically. Its primary mechanism of action is the carboxylation of a protein called osteocalcin.
Okay, let's break down that carboxylation process, because the source material gets pretty heavy into this. How does that physically move calcium around the body?
So osteocalcin is secreted by your bone-building cells, but in its undercarboxylated state, it is essentially inert. It can't bind to anything.
It's just floating there.
Right. But when vitamin K2-MK7 interacts with it, it alters the physical structure of the protein. It basically gives it molecular claws.
Claws, I love that.
Yeah, and these activated claws can now grab circulating calcium right out of the bloodstream and bind it directly into your bone matrix.
So wait, without MK7 activating those proteins, you just have free-floating calcium in your blood.
Exactly. And that calcium aggressively looks for places to deposit itself, which often means it ends up calcifying inside your arterial walls or your kidneys.
Wow, which is a huge driver of arterial stiffness and heart issues.
Precisely. And the advantage of the MK7 forms specifically over other forms like MK4 is its prolonged half-life.
How much longer are we talking?
Well, MK4 clears from the blood in a matter of hours. MK7 remains active in the serum for up to 72 hours.
Oh, wow. That's a massive difference.
It is. It allows for continuous steady-state carboxylation of those critical proteins.
But routing calcium effectively assumes you aren't simultaneously flooding the intestines with competing minerals. And this is one of the most fascinating mechanisms detailed in the guide, the concept of mineral traffic jams.
Yes, the biological reality that taking one highly active compound can actively shut down the absorption of another.
Nutrients operate in a highly competitive biological matrix, don't they?
They really do. A perfect example is the relationship between calcium and iron. They both utilize the exact same cellular gateway in the intestines, known as the divalent metal transporter 1. Or DMT1.
So it's essentially a single-lane bridge.
That's a perfect analogy.
So if you take a heavy calcium supplement right alongside an iron supplement, the calcium essentially floods the bridge, and the iron molecules are just left stranded on the wrong side of the intestinal wall.
Right. They're unable to cross over into the bloodstream, and they are simply excreted.
That is wild.
And the interactions go deeper than just shared transporters. Look at zinc and copper.
Oh, right, I read this part.
If you consume excessive amounts of zinc, it triggers your intestinal cells to rapidly produce a protein called metallothionein.
Okay, metallothionein.
Yes. This protein acts like a sponge. It binds tightly to metals to prevent toxicity. However, metallothionein has a much stronger affinity for copper than it does for zinc.
Wait, really? So the protein intended to manage the zinc ends up trapping all your dietary copper?
Exactly. It traps it in the intestinal cells, which eventually just slough off and leave your body.
So let me get this straight.
Yeah.
You aggressively supplement zinc because you want to support your immune system.
Yeah.
And in doing so, you inadvertently induce a severe copper deficiency.
Yes, which can lead to actual neurological issues.
This raises an important question regarding the prevalent culture of megadosing. Because I have to admit, if I feel run down, my first instinct is to blast my system with a mega dose of vitamins to fix it. Are you saying that's actually backfiring?
This raises an important question indeed. The instinct for many, at the first sign of fatigue, is to administer a massive loading dose. But the downstream effect of that strategy is often receptor downregulation or toxic accumulation.
I mean, my thought process is, if a 50 milligram dose is the baseline, taking the 1,000 milligrams during a stressful week is like giving my body overwhelming ammunition.
Right, but the scientific consensus heavily relies on established upper intake levels, or ULs, set by the NIH.
Okay, but aren't water-soluble vitamins safe to megadose? Like vitamin C or the B complex? Because the assumption is that the excess is just excreted in your urine, right?
Mostly, yes. But chronic megadosing of water-soluble vitamins can still mask underlying pathologies.
Give me an example of that.
Well, massive doses of folic acid, for instance, can completely mask the hematological signs of a severe B12 deficiency.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, allowing irreversible neurological damage to progress completely unnoticed.
That is terrifying. And the risk profile compounds exponentially when we look at the fat-soluble vitamins, right? A, D, E, and K.
Because they lack a rapid excretion pathway. They partition into your hepatic tissue, your liver, and your fat stores.
So they just build up over time.
Exactly. Persistent megadosing of synthetic vitamin A, for example, can lead to chronic hepatotoxicity and even elevated intracranial pressure.
So the biological principle is clear. The lowest effective dose is always superior to systemic saturation.
Yeah.
Especially for special populations, right? Like pregnant individuals.
Absolutely. They need very specific folate and iodine levels without crossing into excessive intake. Clinician guidance is absolutely critical there.
And the power of these compounds is undeniable, especially when we consider how they interact with pharmaceutical pathways. Like, since we discussed K2, MK7 activating proteins earlier, we have to look at how that interacts with medications.
Right, specifically anticoagulants. Drugs like warfarin function precisely by acting as vitamin K antagonists.
Okay, meaning they actively block vitamin K.
Yes. They inhibit the enzyme responsible for recycling vitamin K in the body, thereby slowing down blood clotting.
So, if you introduce a highly bioavailable, long-lasting supplement like that K2, MK7 we talked about,
You are directly overriding the pharmaceutical blockade.
you're supplying the exact compound the drug is trying to suppress.
Exactly, which can destabilize a patient's coagulation metrics drastically.
Man, if a shotgun blast of nutrients causes this much collateral damage, I mean, mineral competition, receptor downregulation, pharmaceutical interference, the only logical evolution for the industry is sniper-level precision.
That's a great way to put it.
And that is exactly what the source material points to for the 2026 landscape.
Yeah.
We're moving entirely away from the generic multivitamin model.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the defining shift in high-performance supplementation is the integration of nutrigenomics and continuous biomarker analysis.
Nutrigenomics, so treating based on your genes.
Right. The era of guessing your metabolic needs based on broad population averages is ending.
We are looking at a hyper-personalized protocol now. You aren't just taking methylcobalamin because some wellness blog told you to.
Yeah.
You're taking it because your genetic assay confirmed an MTHFR polymorphism.
Exactly.
You aren't blindly supplementing D3. You're dosing it based on your specific vitamin D receptor or VDR genetic variants. And you're calibrating that against a quarterly blood panel.
The clinical data now drives the formulation, and we are seeing this precision radically alter how the scientific community approaches entire categories of supplements, particularly antioxidants.
Yeah, let's talk about antioxidants, because for decades, the trend was to isolate these powerful antioxidants, like high-dose vitamin E or synthetic beta-carotene, into single capsules to eradicate free radicals.
Right, that was the old model. But the current consensus is aggressively pulling back from that isolationist approach. The biology of stress is just much more nuanced than that.
How so?
It comes down to the principle of hormesis.
Hormesis.
Right. Your body often requires transient spikes in reactive oxygen species, those free radicals, to trigger its own endogenous defense systems.
So we actually need the stress signal.
Exactly. When you flood the system with isolated high-dose antioxidant supplements, you acutely blunt that necessary biological signal. You actually prevent the body from adapting and strengthening its own cellular resilience.
Which is why the 2026 standard is strongly reverting to a food-first matrix for antioxidants. The complex interactive web of polyphenols and flavonoids in a whole food source provides a balanced signaling environment, and an isolated synthetic pill just cannot replicate that.
Right. The mandate for manufacturers now is total transparency and metabolic relevance. We're looking at clean labels with explicit molecular forms, explicit per-serving dosages, transparent allergen statements, organic sourcing.
All verified by third-party chromatography, targeting specific genetic and biomarker deficits.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive staring at a massive wall of opaque, aggressively marketed plastic bottles. But when you strip away the branding and look strictly at the biochemistry, a very clear protocol emerges for you, the listener.
It really does.
You demand the NSF or USP verification to ensure the molecule actually exists in the formulation. You reject the proprietary blend because you refuse to ingest a hidden runtime of unknown variables.
Absolutely.
You select the specific chemical isomer, the D3s, the methylcobalamins, the MK7s, that actually align with human metabolic pathways rather than just manufacturing profit margins. And most importantly, you respect the intricate balance of those divalent metal transporters and methylation cycles.
Right. Understanding that massive blind loading doses are biologically reckless.
Exactly. The realization is that supplementation is not just some passive addition to your diet. It is an active, targeted manipulation of your cellular pathways.
It demands a much higher level of critical interaction from the consumer.
It absolutely does. Which leaves me with a final thought for you to consider. If our understanding of these pathways is now becoming so entirely dependent on our individual genetic variants and real-time biomarker feedback, how long until the static, mass-produced multivitamin completely disappears from the shelves?
That's a fascinating question.
Right. We are already seeing the integration of continuous glucose monitors and hydration wearables everywhere. Are we just a few iterative cycles away from transdermal patches or smart dispensers that sample our blood chemistry overnight and then synthesize the exact microdose of an isolated nutrient we need for that specific Tuesday morning?
The technology for that closed-loop biological feedback is rapidly converging.
It really is. It definitely frames that overwhelming supplement aisle in a completely different light. Something to think about next time you walk down it.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, and we will catch you next time.